The movie begins at a send-off party for the astronauts of Mars 1 mission a day before its liftoff. One of the astronauts for the next day's mission is Nicholas Willis, who's sitting next to a girl trying to sleep with her before leaving for the mission. Others are the only married couple in the crew, Terry Fisher and Woody Blake. Then there's Renee Cote, Sergei Kirov, Phil Olemeyer, and Luke Graham. The mission will be divided into two teams, Mars 1 and Mars 2, respectively. Despite the party spirit, Luke anxiously waits for someone whom he fears would not come. His wife, Deborah, consoles him, however, he knows that the mission was not originally his to celebrate. She then tells him to spend time with her son, Bobby, who's up in his fort, upset about his dad leaving. Luke reads him his favorite book every night before bedtime, but now that he's going away for a mission, he assures Bobby he will bring his copy into space so both of them can finish the book together. Deborah and Luke greet him, saying they almost thought Jim wouldn't come. Everyone is delighted to see Jim. Later that night, Jim, Woody, and Luke enjoy a lively conversation, but the atmosphere gets heavier when Jim mentions a woman who would be happy to see Woody and Luke go on the mission. Before Jim leaves, Luke mentions that the mission originally belonged to Jim and a woman named Maggie. Turns out, Maggie is Jim's wife, who trained with him for 12 years for the Mars mission. However, Maggie had fallen ill, and Jim decided to withdraw from the mission to take care of her. Eventually, she passed away. Luke expresses his regrets for having to continue the mission without the people who truly deserved it. Jim embraces him as they say their goodbyes. 13 months later, the crew consisting of Luke, Nick, Renee, and Sergei land at Cydonia, Mars. They soon discover a gigantic mountain with an unusual shiny pointed top. They contact the World Space Station where Jim, Woody, Terry, and Phil are, monitoring their mission to let them know of the anomaly and that they're heading out to check it closer. They believe it to be an ice cap, which could be the key for a human population to thrive on Mars. The crew soon arrive at the site and hear a strange, low pulsating noise coming from the mountain. Luke orders a scan, expecting it to be ice. However, their scan shows that underneath the layer of dust is an object of solid metal. Luke believes it was just interference, so he tells Sergei and Renee to do a closer scan. Sergei detects a signal, and suddenly, the low, pulsating noise stops. Seconds later, the mountain unleashes a powerful energy wave that creates a gigantic cylinder made of sand around the metal object. A gigantic tornado forms that swallow debris and rocks around the area. The vacuum effect of the tornado intensifies, and the swirling sand starts to form into a snake-like sentient creature that towers over Renee and Sergei. They both turn their backs, trying to flee. A huge, hurtling rock hits Renee's helmet, instantly killing her. Sergei disappears into the vortex, screaming, and Luke watches as the last one of his crew gets swallowed by the tornado, tumbling like a rag doll before disintegrating into pieces. Then, the tornado abruptly vanishes, with the only survivor being Luke. A massive metal face emerges from where the mountain was after the dust settles. Meanwhile, in the World Space Station, a meeting is called when the station picks up the catastrophic energy wave from Mars, which cuts all their communications. They manage to intercept a video transmission from Luke that they can barely translate. Luke appears badly injured. He informs them of what happened to the rest of the crew. Woody and Jim insist on going on a recovery mission, but Ray Beck, the station commander, believes that there is a small chance that Luke is alive, not to mention that the surface is still dangerous. Phil suggests using the Saturn Imaging Probe, or SEMA, to orbit Mars and take pictures to determine if Luke is still alive. After several appeals, Ray reluctantly agrees and orders Jim to hand him a mission plan the next day. As soon as the others leave, Woody insists on having Jim fly with him, but Ray doubts Jim can handle it. Woody manages to convince him that Jim is the best shot they have, since he trained the longest for this mission and has designed the entire mission plan. Woody promises to bring Luke alive. After several months of preparation, the Mars recovery spacecraft manned by Jim, Woody, Terry, and Phil approaches Mars. Woody informs Jim that they will intercept SEMA in a few hours. The probe has captured images of Mars 1 base camp, where they see the Earth return vehicle still standing. They zoom in on the footage and see 3 graves belonging to the deceased astronauts. Phil believes that Luke is still alive. However, Terry notes it can also mean that there is no one left to bury Luke after he passed away. They run a scan on the source of the energy pulse and discover it was still there. Later, Ray informs them that a ground search is advisable to find Luke, and happily tells them that they are clear for landing on Mars the next morning. As the crew prepares to enter Mars's atmosphere, several meteoroids puncture through the hull of the ship, causing the ship to start losing oxygen. Woody goes out to patch up the holes, and Phil manages to get the ship back online just seconds before the ship's atmosphere falls to 0. Unbeknownst to them, the meteoroids have punctured their fuel tanks, causing a leak during fuel intake. When they start up their engine, the fire comes in contact with the floating fuel, triggering an explosion. The impact destroys the engine of their ship. Without control, they have to get to the resupply module before they burn into the atmosphere. Jim suggests using the Remo as a landing pod. The only choice they have left is to abandon their ship and transfer to the Remo in just their spacesuits. The crew heads out into space, tied up to each other, and aim for the Remo. However, they miscalculated its distance. Woody volunteers to separate himself from the rest of the crew to hook up the end of the grappling gun to the Remo, giving the others a chance to safely get closer to the module. With little fuel in his suit, he charges toward the module and manages to hook the end of the wire, but he overshoots himself, causing him to float away without any fuel. The crew pull themselves to the module, and Jim suggests they wait for Seema to orbit in their direction to get Woody. However, they don't have enough time, so Terry uses her fuel to save Woody. When Terry has consumed half of her fuel, almost reaching the point of no return, Woody tries to convince her to stop. Terry refuses to give up. She cannot lose Woody and watch him die. She then uses the grappling gun to reach Woody, but the wire is a little too short. She pulls back the wire for another attempt and insists on getting closer to reach Woody. That's when Woody realizes that Terry might get herself killed if she doesn't stop. So he removes his helmet and sacrifices himself to force her to go back. Terry has not much time to mourn the passing of her husband as they need to land on Mars. Using the resupply module, Jim, Phil, and Terry land on Mars and pull their supplies toward the base camp. They start checking for the equipment and oxygen needed for their return to Earth. Though damaged, they can still salvage everything they need for a trip back home. Jim checks the ERV and discovers that their experimental greenhouse worked. Suddenly, he is attacked by Luke, who thinks he is just part of his hallucinations. Jim manages to convince Luke he is real by mentioning the title of his son's favorite book, which they read together at night. Luke regains his sanity and explains what happens to the rest of his crew. During the time he was alone on Mars, Luke managed to get the experimental greenhouse working, allowing him to live for the year before they arrived. However, he tells them he did not survive, but was spared to figure out a secret. Puzzled, Jim asks him what he's talking about. Luke then shows them footage of the gigantic metal face, the source of the intense energy pulse. The others stare in disbelief, knowing that the famous face on Mars captured by satellites before was true. Someone has been there before them. Jim asks about the sound his team heard when they first encountered the face. Luke explains he finally managed to translate it after months of analyzing. He comes up with an illustration of DNA. He believes that whoever left the thing also created the signal as a sign of their identity, a self-portrait to let other beings know of their existence. Looking at the illustration, Terry notices a missing pair of chromosomes at the end and figures out it was not of humans. While Jim and Luke prepare for their trip back home, Jim spills out some candies and remembers the candy DNA Phil was playing with at the spacecraft. He realizes that the signal was not a declaration, but a test to have them prove they are human. The signal the previous crew transmitted was perceived as a wrong answer. Jim plans to insert the correct pair of chromosomes into the signal and transmit it back to the face. The others are hesitant about his plan as they cannot risk losing another, but Luke comes up with an idea. They use the rover to get close to the face while they suit up and lock themselves inside an airtight room in case the plan fails. Luke begins the transmission of the signal carrying the correct answer, and the face begins to glow bright, opening a white doorway. Jim has Phil stay and fix the return module while he, Luke, and Terry head out for the doorway. He then orders Phil to leave at a specific time with or without them, to which Phil agrees. They enter the doorway and find themselves in an empty, white-painted room. The door closes behind them, causing them to lose contact with Phil. Jim scans the room and learns that there is oxygen present inside, which allows them to breathe without relying on their suits. They step into a room that shows a 3D model of the solar system. The only difference is that Mars is a green and blue planet like Earth. A tall, slender red Martian appears behind them as if it's telling a story. Martians originally inhabited Mars, but an asteroid hit the planet. This forced the Martians to abandon the planet to live in another galaxy. One ship remained, carrying the DNA strand of the Martians, who sent it to Earth. The single-cell organisms brought by the ship eventually evolved into complex organisms like humans millions of years after. Martians seeded Earth, and humans came from Martians. The Martian disappears, and they realize that the face is a ship and has started its countdown for takeoff. Terry and Luke prepare to leave, but Jim wants to stay. Honoring Maggie's memory, Jim feels like it was the right thing to do, to come home where the rest of their Martian ancestors await. Terry and Luke eventually agree, and they share a farewell embrace before they head out for the return module. Jim steps into a glowing platform that takes him to the ship at the top. Water starts filling up the chamber, and he tries to hold his breath for as long as he can. Meanwhile, Terry and Luke barely made it back to the return module seconds before Phil presses the ignition. At the Martian ship, Jim starts shaking, fighting for his life. He eventually inhales the water and discovers he can breathe in it. Memories of his life flash before his eyes. It stops, and a smile forms on his face, realizing he's finally doing what he was born to do. He smiles, knowing that Maggie would be the most proud. The ship takes off at an incredible pace, passing by the return module like a flash. From the cockpit, Terry, Luke, and Phil watch as Jim speeds off into another galaxy. Luke wishes Jim success in his journey, knowing that his friend is finally where he belongs, in space, along with the stars. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click here for another movie recap video. See you in the next video.